All right, I'm going to try to go through. I have a lot of information to cover. I always point out in class that this reading and then the next reading are really topics that we could spend an entire semester focused on. So I'm just going to try to hit really key points and emphasize the main things. What I like to do with this reading and for today are kind of twofold. One, introduce W.E.B. Du Bois because I think he's a fundamental thinker and influence on public education in the 20th century. And then, most importantly, really detail African American education, starting kind of with the post Civil War era through the somewhat into the contemporary period. And this is a topic that we'll pick up with the next reading. And so, in many ways, this reading kind of hopefully sets the stage and brings us into the Brown versus Board of Education topic. Obviously, it's really hard again to cover this much information in one lecture and one class period. But I do think it should illuminate or cover a lot of key points. So we want to talk a little bit about Du Bois, his idea of double consciousness in the veil. We'll talk about how Du Bois frames prejudice in the South, and then we'll talk about education, and then primarily in relation to the post-Civil War era and the Industrial Revolution, and then we'll detail the training schools or industrial schools, and then the black colleges and universities. Okay, so a little bit of background with Du Bois. He was born, essentially right after the end of slavery, right at the end of slavery, and then died right before Dr. King's March on Washington. So he lived this incredibly expansive time period that was central to civil rights in the United States. And we'll go over a little bit more of the kind of key context around the post-Civil War era with the next reading and the next lecture. Really quickly, again, a really brief overview of Du Bois. He was born in Massachusetts, but his family moved to Tennessee, and he showed a lot of promise as a young student. He wanted to go to Harvard. That was out of reach for a young African American working class child in Tennessee at the time. But his community believed in him so much that they took up a collection and helped him go to Fisk University. Fisk is an HBCU in right outside of Nashville, Tennessee, right on the edge of Nashville. And I just mentioned I was there a few years ago, and I was wandering around campus. It's a beautiful campus with tremendous history, a lot of really wonderful things on the campus. But there's a statue that I wanted to get to, particularly of Du Bois, kind of overlooking, and it's kind of off on the side. One of the quick side note is with all the talk of commemoration and statues and things that's gone on in recent years. I've always wondered why there are not more points of commemoration for W.E.B. Du Bois. I really look at him as one of our nation's most prominent and important influential intellectuals. He's someone who's known in university throughout Europe, and he influenced sociology, psychology, history, philosophy, a tremendous number of areas in the United States. He was the first African American to graduate from Harvard. He graduated from Fisk. And then it's important to note that he spent a while teaching before he went on to Harvard. He was a teacher. This is his teaching license, and he taught in Tennessee. And that the chapter on the meaning of progress in the Souls of Black Folk that we'll cover is his reflections on his time as a teacher. The chapter basically covers when he was went off to teach, and then he returned about 10 years later to the same community. This is with his graduating class at Fisk. Like I said, he went on to become the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard, and to point out how driven he was, Harvard would not accept his undergraduate transcript, so he literally repeated his entire undergraduate degree in order to graduate from Harvard. He's really one of the most educated people in the United States for a long period of time. He even did a postdoctoral um, kind of appointment in Germany after Harvard. Incredibly driven and then incredibly accomplished. His first kind of official teaching position was Atlanta University, which still exists. The name's changed, but it still exists today. Um, some of the things that he helped influence. He was one of the founders of the nation's longest running, one of the earliest and longest running African American publications, The Crisis. Um, he helped found the NAACP, the nation's oldest and arguably most influential civil rights organizations. He was a key founding member of that. He pushed to actually name it more broadly so that it was more encompassing. Um, and his study, I'll just as a side note, he wrote a number of really influential works on. He wrote probably the seminal work on history of the Reconstruction era, but his study, the Philadelphia Negro, he spent an entire year. I think he interviewed over 9,600 families, African American families in Philadelphia, and I think it was just really influential on sociology. And in the study, he critiqued the idea that African Americans were in any way inferior. He pointed out that a lot of different things like low life expectancy and things like that were connected more to occupational hazards, to poverty, to those kinds of things. So showing again the sociological factors. Um, I think it's helpful. A good way to understand Du Bois is in relation to Booker T. Washington. Again, incredibly hard to sum up in a short period of time, but in some ways, you could kind of compare them in certain ways to Dr. King and Malcolm X in that, I mean, not that they shared any of the same views with those people, but just in that they were civil rights leaders around the same period of time who maybe in some ways had a similar hope or vision for the future, but had very different ways of trying to achieve those goals. Booker T. Washington wanted a kind of slow assimilation of the African American community in the post-slavery era. I think he felt that African Americans, by working even as domestic servants, that one, they would begin to develop some financial independence, but then that they would slowly integrate and become more comfortable in proximity to whites, and he felt that blacks needed to earn their kind of rights and things over time. Du Bois, on the other hand, I think felt that African Americans really needed to kind of claim or to some extent demand their rights. Um, he had a much more, I think, straightforward or aggressive way. As an example, I mean, Washington would have advocated more for industrial training, um, so that African Americans could take somewhat menial labor jobs. Du Bois wanted a college education for at least for a portion or percentage of African Americans, and he didn't think that African Americans would be taken seriously until they kind of demanded those rights and until there was an educated class of African Americans in the United States. Um, Booker T. Washington kind of accepted segregation to a certain extent. Washington or Du Bois wanted integration. He wanted um, rights on par with whites. And I'll just mention as a quick side note with the Washington Du Bois debate that I'll share a link on Canvas, and in class I play a section of the documentary "Tell Them We Are Rising," and I think that the beginning of that does a really really good job of setting up and explaining. One, it's an overall really good documentary on historically black colleges and universities, but it also does a good job of explaining and helping to understand the historical context and then somewhat of the divide between Washington and Du Bois. So on the meaning of progress, again, this is Du Bois's reflection of teaching in Tennessee, rural Tennessee, and leaving that community and then returning 10 years later. Josie is one of the main figures in this story. One of the things about the Souls of Black Folk, which this reading is drawn from, is there are sections that to me really read sort of like a fairy tale almost. Or the way I've described it is there are parts that are kind of like watching a movie, and then it switches into a documentary. So he talks very explicitly about the context of the time period, but there are other parts that are written in a very kind of literary way. And he opens the chapter with a reference to a poem that's about Joan of Arc, and I think in a similar way, Josie is this really outstanding young woman with lots of promise, who goes to work on behalf of her family to provide, but also ultimately is a tragic figure. He goes back to find out that she's died, and the struggles of poverty, and I think that in some ways you could look at the meaning of progress as a bit of a cynical or dark chapter of the book, but I really think that Du Bois, there's a lot of reality in what he's writing about. I mean, progress is even if you look at today, like a lot of the economic changes with automation and other things, maybe as a whole we would consider them to be progress, but that going through that progress means the loss of a lot of jobs, a lot of struggle, a lot of challenges, and that I think is what Du Bois is really sort of teasing out in the piece, and specifically for his time period, the post-Reconstruction era after slavery was a tremendously difficult time for African Americans, and that's what he's detailing. As part of this, if you haven't read The Souls of Black Folk, we're only reading sections of it. I would highly recommend. The entire book is very compelling and interesting. I would highly recommend reading it. There's a lot of key themes in it, but the one that I really wanted to emphasize that kind of relates to the two chapters that we're reading are double consciousness and the veil. Now again, it's a very complicated, I think, philosophical concept that you could spend a lot of time teasing out and reflecting on, but essentially the veil for Du Bois is kind of the state that African Americans find themselves in, that they're sort of marked in a certain way in society or seen through a certain lens. And sometimes he points out, even in the chapter, that this can be, he talks about sometimes even being treated, even by people that we would consider maybe even somewhat progressive or something, that treated as an object of pity or just seen through a certain lens, through a certain context of difference. And the veil relates to what he says is kind of a double consciousness in African Americans, that African Americans see themselves both in some way through the eyes of their family and friends and their own, as having their own consciousness, but also being aware that they're looked at differently by whites in society. So that it creates a kind of double consciousness. And there are other elements of this as well, that, for example, African Americans have this distinctive position of seeing themselves as American or in America, but as Americans, but also as Africans, and this complex relationship with what it means to be American, coming from the legacy of slavery and things like that. So it leaves somewhat of a divided consciousness for Du Bois. And I think in some ways you could say that much of his work throughout his life was really trying to kind of resolve this complexity. And so he talks a lot in the book, The Souls of Black Folk, again, about this concept in reality, that even when, on the one hand, he's with his classmates at Fisk, they're excited and, to go out into the world, to take their first professional jobs, to be, to teach, to work in the community. And yet, even at this great time of great optimism and excitement, he's constantly reminded of his blackness and being treated differently. He's forced to sit in segregated cars. He's forced to, even when he visits the one family, about a job, the chancellor of the school. He has to sit and eat in a different room. There are these constant kind of reminders um, of his situation in the United States, and that's what he's referencing with the veil and double consciousness. And there's a lot of great quotes. I would just mention, if you haven't seen Jordan Peele's Get Out, the movie, I think one of the interesting contexts today is that this movie really, has some obvious references to slavery in the film, but also to what Du Bois is talking about. And if you've seen it, the main character, who's black, goes to visit his white girlfriend's family in a kind of upper class suburban area, and it's almost like, even if people are trying to make him, in a sense, feel more comfortable, or that by doing so they often remind him of his blackness. And then the sunken place, which is a key part of the movie, is again that idea of seeing through someone else's eyes, that kind of idea of double consciousness. So I just thought I'd make that connection. All right. So after the Civil War, I wanted to point out that what Du Bois details in the next chapter on the training of black men is that there were several attempts made to provide educational opportunities. I think it's important to emphasize that the period of slavery, the one thing that slave owners were legally forbidden to do, the only laws that prevented slave owners, or prevented people more generally from doing with slaves, was educating them. That those were the only laws at the time, were literacy laws. The only thing that slaves were, protection, were things that, the only legal references were against providing educational opportunity or literacy. There were literally laws to prevent that. And so in the following era after slavery, there's a big question then of of the context and what to do. And so the army set up school. There were mission schools. There were several different approaches to education. And what Du Bois portrays these as is, he says that they were often, I think, good attempts at education, but they were often pretty chaotic and sporadic, and did not provide the kind of opportunity needed. And so there was an emphasis to both provide education after the Civil War, and then to address the demands of the Industrial Revolution, to train African Americans for the type of employment and things that were available at that time period. And of course, this is when the Industrial Revolution is spreading to the southern region, and then the South has this complex issue of trying to transfer after slavery from a primarily agrarian society, one based on farming and agriculture, to one with a balance to other forms of manufacturing. And so one of the things that happens at this time period is the establishment, or the need for black teachers, African American teachers. And so there's an effort made to establish training schools for African Americans to begin working with African American students. And I one of the things that I really want for future teachers to be aware of and to know are about HBCUs. Again, a topic we could spend hours talking about, but essentially the term HBCU references historically black colleges and universities. There are, I think, about somewhere between 90 and 100, if I remember correctly, around the United States. The simple definition is just any institution that prior to 1964 had a legacy of accepting or supporting African American students was designated with this term or this designation. And there are, again, many in the United States still today. There are some famous ones that remain predominantly African American, like Spelman, Morehouse, Howard in DC. There are others that are today maybe predominantly white institutions, or have a lot of white students, or more than 50%. So, there are many that are mixed. I had really thought about going to Morgan in Baltimore, where I grew up, and had a number of friends that went there. My sister in law went to Howard. So there's a number in the area that still exist. They're not exclusively for African Americans, it's just a number of them. Um, there are some of them that remain predominantly African American, and Morehouse being one of them. Example, that's where Dr. King graduated from. Um, a lot of prominent African Americans have graduated from HBCUs. Oprah graduated from Spelman. Um, and I believe today Howard still produces the overwhelming majority of African American medical professionals. So they still play a central role in the development of the African American community. DuBois really supported these schools, the development of these schools. They, as a side note, they all pretty much started as teacher training institutes, but he felt that African Americans needed to have access to higher education, and pointed out that as Yale and Harvard had opened their doors to African Americans were going there and being successful, and all they needed was the opportunity there to be successful. And that for him is the function of education. He talks about civilization, that it's a necessary component of civilization, and then to deal with racism, to help erase the stain of racism. And one of the things that I've talked more in depth about in class, again in relation to this issue, are the lynchings. And I use these as examples because I think they were central to Du Bois at the time period. They were something that weighed heavily on him, and that he spent and devoted a lot of time to. The Crisis, for example, his magazine, and the NAACP. I always point out the show American Pickers, there are actually people that do that job, that travel around and buy things at yard sales in different places. And a person who did this job eventually started noticing there were postcards that were sold at lynchings around the U.S., and developed a website called Without Sanctuary. And eventually he put on a display at the Chicago Museum of Art with all of these. There are hundreds of them. Many of them are really disturbing and graphic. But I just always like to point out that these were very like popular events. They often drew large crowds of thousands of people. This is a reference to one in Illinois, in central Illinois. And then you can see here, this is the same lynching where there are thousands of people. And people often posed for pictures. A number of them happened at schools, but I think that they were very much terrorism in the sense that they sent a message to people about their place in society, their vulnerabilities, and those types of things. A lot of times the charges were falsified against individuals, or people were unfairly scapegoated for crimes, which is why they didn't go through the normal legal processes, why they were outside that. And to give a reference here to Muncie, the last public lynching in the United States was held in Marion, Indiana, but the bodies were actually brought back to Muncie, to the Whiteley community, and they were protected by the community overnight, and then buried. And one of the individuals from that lynching actually escaped, was later pardoned by the governor of Indiana, and has gone on to become a well-known civil rights activist. So there's a connection here to Muncie. But again, when he talks about civilization and to deal with prejudice, it's a very key component of his time period. All right, in terms of the industrial school and the black colleges, Du Bois describes the industrial school as, I think, in some ways somewhat of a positive step out of slavery. It was important for him, for example, that African Americans begin to earn a wage, or have, that was what was robbed of them during slavery. And so to some extent, to make this step forward, I don't think he discounts it entirely. He also he felt very strongly about work, the value in work, and he felt as well that that industrial jobs were positive for a lot of African Americans. That wasn't the issue for him. His problem was that what he saw the industrial schools doing was looking at African Americans solely as a source of labor and not trying to develop them more fully as citizens and human beings. And he thought this is the essential need for the African American community, that it can't just be development for labor, and the reduction of that. And he has a bunch of great quotes related to that. That that education needs to nourish the entire human being, the entire person, and not just view them as labor. And so for black colleges and universities, this is what Du Bois ended up supporting throughout the United States. He quotes in the reading, and I think this is important to draw attention to, but he quotes that a lot of whites began in the South to oppose black colleges, and and saw them as worthless, and there were a lot of like editorials, and he posts one here, and what he responds to this with, to this idea that the black colleges were not helpful, is he uses evidence and research from New England and communities where educational opportunity was provided to African Americans, and the number of African Americans who had entered into professions, who had become teachers, clergymen, who took on a number of different professional roles, and how it had improved the lives of African Americans. So he uses evidence to refute this idea that the black colleges were not successful in that time period. He says the greatest struggle of the future is going to be racism, and again, that education is needed to combat that. So I feel like I've covered a lot of the main points. In class, a lot of times I talk a little more contextually about Du Bois. I always think that one of the things Du Bois is really pushing in his writing is for self-determination among the black community. And if you look at any civil rights movements that have existed among, whether it's indigenous people or women, self-determination, I think, is a key component of that. And then one of the things I've always liked to do when talking about Du Bois and sort of looking toward the future is to connect Bobby Kennedy's visit campaign in the 1960s. Completely unprecedented campaign. He was meeting with different people in the community. But in April 4th, 1964, he came to Ball State University. He spoke in the gym at Ball State University, and he was on his way to a predominantly black community in Indianapolis, and he learned of the assassination of Dr. King. I'll share the video of his speech on Canvas. He was told not to go into Indianapolis. He said there would be violence. He decided to go anyway. He spoke off the cuff for about 8 minutes to the community. But about prejudice, about racism, about the assassination. It was the first time he had connected to his own brother's assassination. And then, of course, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated about 2 to 3 months after this kind of famous event. But unlike other cities that burned and, where there were riots after the assassination of Dr. King, Indianapolis was relatively calm. And there's a memorial in a park dedicated to Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy. And so it's just a special moment that I like to try to connect to Du Bois and kind of, where his life ended and the next generation of civil rights activists picked up. So I hope this is helpful.